This webinar is hosted by the St. Lawrence Eastern Lake Ontario Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, also known as SLELO PRISM. We are one of 8 PRISMs that span the state of New York. Creating a network of partnerships is an integrative approach to invasive species management. The PRISM network is funded by the Environmental Protection Fund in coordination between the Department of Environmental Conservation and various host organizations. The boundaries of the SLELO PRISM include the 5 counties of Oneida, Oswego, Jefferson, Lewis, and part of St. Lawrence. SLELO PRISM is hosted by the Nature Conservancy, and we collaborate with our regional and statewide partners to protect our lands and waters from the impacts of invasive species. A great way to get involved with SLELO is to take the Pledge to Protect. By taking the pledge, you become a protector and receive monthly email blogs showcasing simple actions that you can take to prevent your favorite or protect your favorite water bodies or land spaces from invasive species now for generations to come. In addition, you'll get access to virtual resources and toolboxes, a social media kit, and pre-made graphics with posts that you can share on your social networks. Plus, you'll get chances to win prizes. You can scan the QR code or visit ipledgetoprotect.org to take the pledge today. And volunteering is another great way to get involved. You can join removal or restoration efforts, guided paddles and hikes, and much more. Those who volunteer with us can participate in a challenge where you can earn prizes for joining us. And lastly, I'd just like to invite you to join us for a 3-part learning series to be held this spring and summer. This training is perfect for anyone who wants to learn more about aquatic invasive species, and participants will learn to recognize and report priority species and be invited to adopt a water body to monitor for their presence. Continuing education credits are also available. I'd now like to welcome Neil Gifford, the Conservation Director with the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission, who will discuss a bird banding and tracking program used at the preserve to determine ecosystem health, the impacts of invasive species, and benefits of management, as well as ways homeowners and land managers can support birds. Good to go. You may be muted.
Yep, that's it. It's all good. I was finding the mute button. Apologies.
No worries.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the presentation today, and thank you to the Nature Conservancy and SLELO for the invitation. My name is Neil Gifford. I'm the Conservation Director here at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, which you can see here with a couple of our feathered friends that can tell us an awful lot about the health of this globally rare inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens ecosystem. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that my co-author on this presentation is our conservation biologist, Dr. Stephen Campbell. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background about the place and think a little bit about ecosystem health before we get into the birds and what they can tell us about some of the impacts of our efforts to remove and manage invasive plants. So pine barrens are this globally rare and unique suite of habitat islands scattered across the northeastern United States, principally New England, New York, with a few inland ones in Pennsylvania, and then of course the largest coastal pitch pine scrub oak barrens is the New Jersey pine lands that covers roughly a third of the state of New Jersey. But these are isolated, fire-dependent ecological communities that are disproportionately important for biodiversity conservation. They're also relatively long-lived young forest or early successional habitats that we typically think of as being relatively short-lived in lots of other places on the landscape. But these pine barren sites have been around for many thousands of years. All of these pine barrens, except perhaps the ones that are on the ridge tops, like the Shawangunk Mountains south of the Catskills, are really legacies of glacial outwash soils, in particular glacial outwash sands, and of course, centuries, if not millennia, of indigenous fire stewardship, indigenous firekeeping that actually help to create and maintain the unique plant and animal assemblages that we have within these pine barrens. And we can talk more about that if we have time later. And they're all today conservation reliant because they're all dependent on fire. And as you know, the Northeast is one of the most heavily populated areas of the nation. So we cannot simply allow wildfire to roam the landscape as it once did, meaning that if we're going to protect these places and the rare species that depend on them, that we have to do it. It will take conservation action. And that means that all of these sites and the wildlife that depend on them are conservation reliant today. But most importantly, in particular, when we think about ecosystem health and why it's important to listen to the wildlife, is that none of us that are managing any of the northeastern pine barrens have a reference community to evaluate and understand what our desired future condition is. Well, of course, we all, many of us started with the Nature Conservancy and other NGOs and some state agencies. Well, we all certainly understand the basic fire ecology of many of the plants and some of the animals that live in these systems. None of us inherited a large contiguous block of high quality pine barrens that supported large viable populations of all of these species that are now rare. So when we think about ecosystem health and whether or not we're improving ecosystem health, we don't have a reference community to monitor, which means that our best window into those vital signs of ecosystem health are really the wildlife. Now, the Albany pine bush is unique among the inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens in that it sits on a massive field of very large periglacial sand dunes. So here, the glacial outwash plain was exposed to the wind and swept up into the largest inland dune field in eastern North America, and that unique geological feature, along with the global rare ecology, helped us achieve a National Natural Landmark designation in 2016. The site is also an important bird area and a bird conservation area, and it's the type locality for the endangered Karner blue butterfly. The Karner blue butterfly was originally characterized from specimens collected here in what was then called Karner, New York. And pitch pine scrub oak barrens and the Karner blue are state and globally rare. So the pitch pine scrub oak barrens is a state rarity ranking of S1 from the New York Natural Heritage Program, and NatureServe gives the ecological community a global rank of 2, meaning that there are fewer than 5 occurrences in New York State and fewer than 20 occurrences globally. There were originally around at least 25,000 acres of inland pine barrens in Albany pre-contact. Today, as you'll see in a map in a second, there are fewer than 6,000 acres of open space left within what is a highly urban and fragmented landscape. And NatureServe classifies the pine barrens, the overall ecosystem type, as interior pine barrens, but really it consists of 4 successional variants or 4 ecological communities, according to the New York Natural Heritage Program, that you can see here. And you can think of these as 4 serial stages or 4 ages of inland pine barrens, from the youngest successional northern sandplain grassland to the pitch pine scrub oak barrens to the pitch pine scrub oak thicket and then to pitch pine oak forest. And ultimately, we are trying to manage for some of each of these successional variants on the landscape. But ultimately, the commission takes an ecosystem-based approach or a system-based approach overall, while there are certainly a few things that we do specifically for Karner blue butterflies. The law that created the preserve and the commission in 1988 is all about managing for a viable pitch pine scrub oak barrens and doing that utilizing prescribed fire, wildland fire. And the tools we use in that ecosystem-based management are multifaceted. Initially, when the Nature Conservancy first started the program here in cooperation with the New York State DEC and state parks, we thought simply putting fire on the landscape would solve all the problems. It would deal with invasive species, and we would see native plants like the wild blue lupin pictured here, which is the sole food plant for the endangered Karner blue, would come back. But the reality is, after decades of fire suppression, ecosystem health had deteriorated to a point where fire alone was not simply going to reach our ecosystem goals. So we utilize a variety of tools, including mowing, silvicultural tools, as you'll see in a minute when we talk about black locust, as well as unfortunately some chemical tools to eliminate and reduce non-native invasive plants, but also reduce overabundant native plants like scrub oak in the pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And then those treatments are followed up with seeding. So when we remove black locust clones, we're planting a whole host of locally derived native grasses and wildflowers and turning those locust clones into Carnaby butterfly habitat. But also within the high quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens, after we burn those, we're directly interseeding with that no-till seed drill, wild blue lupin seed at about 3 pounds an acre to help recover the corn blue. Now, I've mentioned black locust. Black locust is literally and figuratively the largest invasive plant that we have been managing here in the Barrens, really since management began in 1991. Black locust is not native to New York. It's native to the southern Appalachians from kind of West Virginia south to Alabama. It is clonal, it is non-native, and it is a legume. Now, if you know anything about pine barrens, they're extremely nutrient poor, and being a legume gives black locust a leg up in invading this ecosystem. And in particular, black locust is a fundamental ecosystem changer. It not only alters the plant species composition and structure, but it also fundamentally changes the soil system, altering nutrient cycling and eradicating the native microbiome that pitch pine, scrub oak, and many of the other plants that live within the pine barrens need. It also eliminates fire. You cannot get fire into black locust clones, and if you can, all it will do is trigger resprouting and make the matter even worse. Our invasive species management plan is online, but to date, we've removed over 600 acres of black locust in the preserve. And here from left to right, you can see kind of a before and after. And with black locust, we're going in and eradicating. What we're looking at here at the top left slide is an isolated clone of black locust within some remnant pine barrens. So here we're cutting the trees down, ripping out the stumps, root raking the site, and then planting that native suite of grasses, wildflowers, some scrub oak, and some pitch pine seedlings. And effectively, you can see the result. And that the lower picture, well, both of these are actually about 3 years after black locust removal. The upper one was a relatively small site. The lower one was a much larger site that's now about 15 years old. And we're within 2 growing seasons, we can effectively eradicate the black locust and restart pine barrens as that northern successional sandplain grassland variant of pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And here you can see overall the whole footprint of what we have managed in the preserve using fire and a variety of other tools, including the black locust removal. Here is a black locust removal. So, and the remnant black locust that was left in 2023, and this past winter we've removed several of those green blobs, including that big one at the upper center of this map. But we've now removed quite a bit of black locust and converted that to successional northern sandplain grassland. And gradually, over the course of time, it takes a couple of decades, pitch pine and scrub oak will gradually move in. So we're removing invasive species and restoring it with locally derived native plants immediately available for Carnaby butterflies and some of the native bees and pollinators. But it takes quite a while for the woody plants to move back in because of the way black locust destroys the ectomycorrhizal fungal community within the soils in particular. But how do we really know if we're actually advancing ecosystem health? Like all of you, I live in a building. I do not live in this ecosystem. However, the wildlife that live out there are much better indicators. So regardless of what we think of what we may be managing for, the best way to monitor ecosystem vital signs is with wildlife, and in particular, by looking at the distribution and abundance of wildlife that need the pitch pine scrub oak barrens in particular. And the Albany pine bush holds a large variety of rare species. There are 114 S1 to S3 wildlife species in the Albany pine bush alone. And that includes 20% of all of the New York State wildlife species of greatest conservation need can be found in this landscape. And that includes, of course, the rare insects like carners and frosted elfins and mottled dusky-winged skippers, over 206 native species of bees, but also a wide variety of birds and reptiles and amphibians. And birds are phenomenal indicators of ecosystem health because they will readily utilize habitat pretty much as soon as it becomes available. So for us, birds are also relatively easy to monitor because they're singing. So what, well, as you'll see in a second, but they tell you when they're here. And of those more than 70 wildlife species of greatest conservation need, it includes 43 birds. And in particular, 14 SGCN bird species that breed in the pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And our avian research is multifaceted. One, we want to look at the changes in distribution and abundance of those pitch pine scrub oak barren specialists over the course of time, and we do that utilizing point counts. So if you look at the map on the upper right, along our trail network, we have approximately 60 point counts that are stationed 300 meters apart, straight line distance 300 meters apart. And we've been monitoring those for over a decade, and we go out multiple times a year with multiple observers and standing at these points for 10 minutes, which is what the data sheet is showing you, and counting all of the birds that we see and hear within 50 meters of where we're standing, recording how many we hear. And what that gives us is the distribution and abundance of singing males, typically. But in addition to, and that allows us to look at the species composition and the distribution of where the birds are in the landscape and how that's changing over time as a result of our management. But we also have several community science projects, and I'm going to talk more about eastern whippoorwill in a minute. But in particular, we have community scientists that come out and monitor eastern whippoorwill, American woodcock, and common nighthawks in the preserve. And then we have, we do a fair amount of bird banding, and I'll talk more about that in a sec as well. MAPS is monitoring avian productivity and survivorship, and MAPS is happening during the breeding season, and it allows us to look at the survival and productivity of birds breeding within about a 35-acre area of high-quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens that we're actively managing with fire. And as you'll see, a couple of species, though, are particularly important and statistically very, very valuable indicators of high-quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens. Prairie warbler is one, and the second is eastern whippoorwill. And you can see a nighthawk there as well, the whippoorwill on the branch, and an American woodcock in the upper center. And that picture on the lower right is a mist net, and one of the reasons why they're called a mist net is typically there's fog in the morning, so it's kind of misty. But it's a net. These are nets that we establish within the barrens on specific days at fixed points and run them to capture birds passively as they're moving through the landscape. The birds are removed from the nets, banded, measured, and then harmlessly released back into the environment. So point counts. One of the things we've realized from our point count data is that several species that used to be here are no longer here. Yellow-breasted chats always had a minor abundance within this landscape, and they've been extirpated since the early 1970s. However, golden-winged warblers, I was surprised to learn when I was doing my initial bird research here, golden-winged warblers were abundant here throughout the 20s, 50s, and into the early 80s. We have not seen golden-winged warblers here since the 1980s, except for during migration. And two species previously considered extirpated are now quite common. The eastern bluebird, of course, and that's a great conservation success story across the East, in particular New York State. That's our New York State bird. So people putting up birdhouses has helped recover eastern bluebirds, and pine warblers have also responded well and are doing well. So which species are good habitat indicators? Our point counts revealed 81 species, and of those 81, there are 6 that statistically were together found in high quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And that's that little table you can see in the lower part of this slide with the indicator value. And I've highlighted the prairie warbler because its statistical value is through the roof. So if there's any one bird we're going to study to look at the quality of pitch pine scrub oak barrens, prairie warblers are one. And we did that for a number of years. You can see that bird in my hand has color bands on it so we can identify individuals through binoculars. But ultimately, we can't, there are 81 species that we have found in the preserve. We can't monitor 81 species, of course, but we can drill down and look more closely at these 6, and in particular, prairie warblers as well. And bird banding initially focused heavily on prairie warbler demography and migration, and then, of course, the maps. And more recently, we are utilizing bird banding to tag, band, and put GPS data loggers on eastern whippoorwill, which have moved back into the preserve after more than 30 years of being absent. So prairie warblers, I mentioned, they're phenomenal indicators of pitchpine scrub oak barrens. We studied them for 3 years, catching and banding them. This is called target netting, where we're going out, we're searching for actively singing males, putting up a net and a decoy and a recording, and the males are defending that territory and come in, we band them, release them, and with the color bands, you can identify one bird from another, follow them to map their territory, hopefully find a female, hopefully she will lead you to a nest. So the map on the lower left is showing you a number of prairie warbler territories in a section of the pitchpine scrub oak barrens in the preserve, and the X's or the crosses are nests that we found. And this allowed us to look at territory size, survival, return rates, and reproduction. And what we found, even within our small sample size, is that prairie warblers are doing remarkably well here. The 2009 nest data is a little skewed because as soon as we found these 24 nests, we had 2 hailstorms within a week and a half, which wiped out all the nests that we had spent weeks searching for and finding. In 2010, we found fewer nests, but overall, the reproductive metrics on prairie warblers here are very high. To give you an indication, an important bird area for prairie warblers used to be 15 pair would make you eligible for an important bird area for prairie warblers with the Audubon Society. And we now have well over a couple hundred pair of prairie warblers breeding in the preserve. But in particular, if you look at that graphic on the lower left, looking at the mean male prairie warbler return rates, having males returning from 1 year to the next, around 70 to 80% of the birds that we catch and band in 1 year are found in the preserve the following year. That is a remarkably high number, and that strong site fidelity and survival is a phenomenal indicator of the quality of the pitchpine scrub oak barrens. So prairie warblers are a good indicator. But again, that's only one species, and we can't really rely on any one species, not corn blue butterflies and not prairie warblers. So we established a MAPS site, 2 sites initially in the preserve. We're using only one now, the northern one. If you look at that aerial photograph on the upper right, it illustrates with those purple and red dashes. Those are actually the net placements, and the net placements are permanent. We have since eliminated the lower map station, but we're still monitoring in the northern one. And MAPS it's actually intercontinental now. It's a Western Hemisphere program established by the Institute for Bird Populations, and it is a standardized protocol where we're banding birds once every 10 days within 7 10-day periods over the course of the breeding season, looking at what species are in this area. By having birds in the hand, we can look at population demographics. So we can look at the age and sex of birds and get a sense of how many young to old birds, how many males to females. Look at survival, look at reproductive condition as well as their health. And that allows us to also look at source sink dynamics, which is one of the things we were concerned about, being that we're a pretty fragmented urban preserve. And to boot, now all of our bird banding data goes to the USGS, who provide us with the bands, but it also goes to the Institute for Bird Populations, and both of those are contributing to hemisphere-wide databases of bird activity. So not only are we collecting information that's useful to us locally, but we're also contributing to the body of knowledge for bird conservation at large. It's one of the great advantages of the MAPS program. And what have we found? Our MAPS program, the 10 most common species we catch in the barrens in the summer are these 10. So catbirds, Baltimore Orioles, American robins, of course, field sparrows. And I mentioned field sparrows not only because we catch a lot of them, but field sparrows, if you look at the breeding bird survey data that the USGS collects, field sparrow populations, while many of us may think of them being a relatively common bird, their populations are declining range-wide at an alarming rate. As well as some song sparrows, a lot of prairie warblers. We've banded over 136 to date. Common yellowthroats, American goldfinch, chickadees, of course, and eastern towhees. And eastern towhee, the number of eastern towhees we catch is deceptive because towhees are phenomenal at self-extracting out of the nets. So they are a little large for the nets that we have, and they if they get captured, they're good at getting themselves out. But those are the 10. So the maps banding is telling us a lot and giving us a lot of useful information within one section of pitch pine scrub oak barrens. But we also utilize community science, as I said earlier, and these are community volunteers that are helping us through standardized methods to collect information on a variety of projects, including eastern whippoorwill presence in the preserve. And they have documented eastern whippoorwills in the preserve since 2007. And on this map of the preserve, the green circles are the places where they have found eastern whippoorwills, and the red circle is still absent. And we think that has to do not with habitat quality, but light pollution as you're getting closer to the more populated parts of the city of Albany. And this is the eastern whippoorwill. So based on the community science work, we realize that we probably have, or potentially have, the beginnings of a new breeding population of whippoorwill in the preserve. Now, whippoorwill are enigmatic and were a common species here up until the early 70s. And people would talk about how if they slept with their windows open this time of year, so the whippoorwills would keep them up at night. They've since been gone now for several decades. So with the community science data telling us that birds were back, we wanted to try and see where are they and how are they interacting with the sites we're managing. So we go out, and again, this is target netting, where we put out a net right after sunset, play a recording, and that calls the male birds in. The males think there's another male whippoorwill in their territory, and they want to chase that supposed individual out, and in the process get snared in our net, harmlessly removed, banded, but then fitted with a GPS data logger. So this is a small GPS tag that fits on the bird with this figure 8 leg loop harness, as you can see in that diagram at the bottom. And that is then collecting GPS data for about 3 to 4 weeks based on how we have them programmed. We then recatch the birds and get the tags off and see where they've been. And the results have been surprising. So we have caught since 2019 9 birds and fit them with GPS data loggers, and we have recaptured 4 of those birds, and one of them multiple times, including last night. We caught a particular male I'm going to show you next 3 years in a row. So I'll be able to show you maps, where his locations over the last couple of years. But one of the most exciting things that happened to us in 2019 was that middle slide. It's one thing to have prospecting male birds moving into the landscape, thinking it looks nice, but maybe or not, they will find females. But that one of those early males in 2019, when we recaptured him, we were thrilled to find that we had a female also in the net. And the main difference you can tell if you look at the tails, the female does not have those white outer tail feathers. That is exclusively a male characteristic. And to boot, she had a full-blown brood patch. So female birds, when they're incubating, lose the feathers on their bellies, and it fills up with fluid. And we can look at that. And she had a full brood patch, which means she was actively sitting on eggs or fledglings, nestlings. And this is an interesting map, just showing you the different birds that we've captured to date. There are 4 birds here, four birds mapped on this map. There's a green, there's a light blue and a dark blue. That's actually the same bird. I'll show you that map in a second. And then the yellow bird. And interestingly, the blue and the green bird is the one that had the female when we recaptured him. And the blue bird now has been in that same location for 3 years. So both of those birds almost certainly have females and have been successfully breeding. The yellow bird in 2019 roamed far and wide, and we suspect that he was not able to successfully find a female. And what we found in it with the GPS data loggers is that these birds are using anywhere from roughly around 30 acres up to 13,000. That yellow bird covered 13,000 acres in 3 weeks, while the other 2 were using a much smaller area and were much more sedentary. And I want to hone in on this bluebird because it really tells us a lot about what we're doing in the landscape to improve ecosystem health. So this is we will call him Blue. This is Blue in 2022, and Blue had a relatively discrete area that he was using, but with some outliers. And if you look here, the dark blue dots are the places that the bird was pegged and located at night. But we were also interested, because the birds are stationary during the day, where are the birds hanging out during the day? So that the lighter or those brighter dots are the noontime fixes that we got for this bird, for Blue. So this is Blue in 2022. Here is Blue in 2023. His territory was cut in half. And what's interesting about that is that in the winter between 2022 and 2023, we removed about 70 acres of black locust and thinned that conifer stand you see in the middle of this circle. So when we went back out in 2023 and recaptured Blue, he had a neighbor that had moved into the area that we had thinned over the winter. And last night, I'm happy to report, we went back out there and caught Blue again. So he is still out there and still has neighbors. But the fact that the birds are in the landscape, the fact that they are quickly within a year moving into areas that were thinning using silvicultural tools, and that Blue's territory shrank, are all great indications that we are improving habitat quality for eastern whippoorwill. And when you consider it in conjunction with the rest of our bird work, helps us really get a picture that we are indeed improving ecosystem health within the pitch pine scrub oak barrens by removing invasive black locust and managing the site with fire. And one of the things that's interesting that the birds have taught us was something that we didn't necessarily appreciate before. When it comes to eastern whippoorwills, they're almost somewhat like ruffed grouse, whereas ruffed grouse, kind of the classic example of a bird in the bird world in ornithology, of a bird that needs multiple seral stages to complete their life cycle. It appears that whippoorwills are very much the same. Whippoorwills are a nocturnal feeder, but they're not bats, of course. They're visual hunters, acting more like a flycatcher from low branches, looking up into the sky using the moonlight and starlight to backlight moths and beetles that are flying. And then much like a flycatcher, if you've ever watched like an eastern phoebe, they're taking off from a low perch to fly out and grab a moth or a beetle that's flying by and then return to that perch. So they need open habitat to feed, but they're nesting and roosting during the day in more dense clumps of pitch pine and oak forest. So maintaining that habitat heterogeneity on the landscape is important. So birds are telling us a lot about ecosystem health. So how can you help birds at home? One, of course, is to continue work to remove and manage invasive plants. If you have the ability to plant and garden, planting locally derived native trees and shrubs, they are the best bird feeders. And we frequently, of course, many of you, like me, probably feed birds at home in the winter and feed them bird seed. But all of those seed eaters during the breeding season, like this time of year, are relying almost exclusively on native insects, and in particular caterpillars of butterflies and moths, to feed their offspring. It takes about 9,000 inchworms to fledge a brood of chickadees, for example. And it's those native trees and shrubs that are feeding all those caterpillars and providing the food that the birds need. So landscaping, in particular with oaks and cherries and pines, those are phenomenal plants for butterflies and moths. And as a result, they make great bird feeders. And to boot, you're providing structure and habitat and nesting structure and places to live for the birds. As well as native plants, of course, provide fruits and seeds. So landscaping with locally derived native plants is a great way to attract birds. So I just want to summarize by saying that managing invasives needs to be about ecosystem health. So it's easy to get stuck in thinking about individual plants and animals, and we need to remove species X to benefit species Y. But the reality, much like the demise of the cornered blue butterfly here and its subsequent recovery, in the introduction of and presence of invasive plants, these are really symptoms of a much bigger problem with ecosystem health. So when we are thinking about managing for invasive species, it's more than just pulling weeds and a gardening exercise. It's much more about improving ecosystem health so that these places can support native plants and animals, in particular, native plants and animals that are conservation reliant. Restoring ecosystem health is a process, not an event, right? It's a long-term commitment. But native wildlife, especially birds, can be powerful, vital signs into ecosystem health, especially when you do not have a reference community to guide your work. And ultimately, reversing biodiversity loss is going to require that we all do what we can wherever we are, right? We are in the Anthropocene. It is very much a human-dominated world today. And if we're going to keep plants and animals around, we pretty much need to be doing conservation work wherever we can. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't say that the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, in addition to being the world's best remaining example of an inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens, is an absolutely phenomenal place to see birds. And the picture you're looking at here, next to our Discovery Center, our educational center, is a former black locust clone about 20 years after having the black locust was removed. And now it supports prairie warblers, corner blue butterflies, frosted elfins, and a host of other plants and animals. And with that, I will say thank you. And in particular, I want to thank the New York State DEC and the legislature for the funding support provided by the Environmental Protection Fund, as well as grants from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and wildfire risk reduction grants from the U.S. Forest Service. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. I've been lucky enough to be able to visit the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, and it was really interesting. I got to see some of the bird banding that was done out there, and it was really cool to see that up close. The work you're doing out there is very impressive and very, very interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll here for those that are wanting the continuing education credits, and then we can do an open discussion
Great.
Q&A session too. Just give me just a moment to get this launched. You should be seeing a poll now.
I do indeed.
Perfect. And if anybody wants to, I'm going to open the chat too and see if we've got questions in here. And if anybody wants to come off of mute, raise your hand. I think I can get you off of mute too, or you might be able to push *6 to get off mute if you have questions or comments.
Thanks again for the opportunity to share our work, Meg.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a really interesting presentation. It's a perfect timing too, because everyone's got birds on their mind. You know, spring is here, and
it is indeed. Yep.
Yeah, just going out in my own backyard, I can see and hear lots of different types of birds, and I'm actually trying to teach myself how to recognize their calls and identify them.
Yep. The Merlin app from Cornell is a phenomenal resource for that. But yeah, it's a wonderful.
Oh yeah, I use that, the Merlin app. Yep. I'll probably throw that in the follow-up email too, as a great resource for folks who want to learn more about birds.
Yep.
A follow-up email will be sent soon, probably early next week, or maybe even a little bit later on today. I just gotta get some time to put the recording, get the recording to download and all that. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I guess we'll just hang tight for a few minutes here, make sure folks who want the continuing education credits can indicate so on this poll. Oh, you posted one in the
Q&A.
Oh, I got the wrong box open. I apologize. All right, perfect. What resources did you consult to determine historic bird populations at the site? For example, earlier in the 20th century. And you can also field these questions in the Q&A if you want to click on that.
Okay. Since everyone can hear me, I'll just answer verbally. Yeah, I found 3 previously published citations of bird work done in the Albany Pine Bush. So I utilized those previous scientific publications to look at changes in bird community over time as historical references. The earliest one was the 1929 study. Yep, and they had some 29, mid-70s and early 80s, and all 3 of them had golden winged warblers being very abundant, comparable to prairie warblers actually. And they both utilize similar habitat structure. Good question.
Can you see the others in the Q&A box?
Oh yeah.
I had the wrong one open too earlier.
Okay.
So
yes. All right. So yes, I can see Nancy. Hi, Nancy. What are the life history traits of the prairie warbler that make it a good habitat indicator for pitch pine scrub oak barrens? Yeah, that's great. Dry open shrublands, so xeric open shrublands, and in particular, females prefer to nest If you looked at, I'm not showing my slides anymore. It's in its highest quality, pitch pine scrub oak barrens is really a grassy shrubland or a shrubby grassland, and that really is the condition that prairie warblers seem to prefer. The scrub oak thickets they're also in, but to a lesser degree. But when we started thinning scrub oak and creating interstitial space, initially for lupin to be able to recover the corn blue butterfly, which we have done successfully, the prairie warbler numbers went up considerably. So they like these open, dry, more xeric shrubby habitats. They will, of course, nest in power line rights of ways and other dry shrubby habitats. But here, if you think about one of the things we're realizing with pine barrens is that for species like prairie warblers, these are important source populations for a lot of those other types of early successional habitats that are more ephemeral or more temporary, like a silvicultural clearing or a thinning, like a lot of the work that's being done in some of the wildlife management areas to create young forest habitat. If that's on more fertile soil, those habitats will be available for prairie warblers for maybe a decade or so, whereas prairie warblers have been living in pitch pine scrub oak barrens probably for thousands of years. But what they, to answer your question, what they seem to be keying in on is that open, low structure of the combination of grasses and shrubs, those grassy areas and the scrub oak barrens. All right, I see an anonymous attendee has asked, given that areas can have many different species of birds, how do you narrow down to the ones you will focus on for this type of habitat? That's a great question, and that's where our point count work came in. So with point counts, we can basically census the entire bird community by listening to who's singing, and based on that, and looking at our vegetation maps, we could look at which species were almost exclusively living within certain habitat types. When we did that for pitch pine with the pitch pine scrub oak barrens, we found that what I call the sweet six. So it's prairie warblers in combination with eastern kingbirds, bluebirds, brown thrashers, eastern towhees, field sparrows, and I'm missing someone. So prairie warblers, brown thrashers, eastern towhee, field sparrow. I'm missing one, an eastern bluebird. Were the sweet six, and of the sweet six, when we looked at the statistics, prairie warblers were by far had the highest indicator value of any of the birds in this landscape for pitch pine scrub oak barrens, and not just any pitch pine scrub oak barrens, but what we understand to be now the highest quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens. So basically, we cast a wide net and then looked at where the birds were living. And honestly, like all of our wildlife work, it's why we listen to why we do a lot of our wildlife work. Again, with our reference community, if we listen to the wildlife, they'll tell us what we need to know. So we just need to know how to look and how to listen. But if we listen to the birds, they have an awful lot to tell us. And then I see Gabriel's question. So hello, Gabe. Can you please offer advice for how to responsibly purchase birdseed mixes that will support local wildlife? That's a good question. I don't have any expertise for that. All I feed in my feeders, well, I feed the hummingbirds, of course, the sugar water, but I feed exclusively black oil sunflower seeds because those, it seems like everybody loves those. Thankfully, not the bears yet. Yeah, I think the best you could do would be to look at the packaging and the sources and see where that material is coming from and what's in it. And of course, you want to try and keep an eye out for any seeds of anything that might be potentially problematic or invasive. Sorry, I don't have a lot of expertise there to be able to share. And then next up, we have Pammy Price. Pammy asks, does the bird you captured last night mean that he is exhibiting site fidelity? Great question. Yes, that is exactly what site fidelity means. So site fidelity, and that's one of the reasons why maps banding at one spot in the pine barrens year after year with permanent net placements can tell us so much. So if birds are successfully able to find all the resources they need, and for that includes males finding females and successfully raising young, they will come back to the same area year after year. So catching that same eastern whippoorwill that I called Blue 3 years in a row in the exact same spot is a phenomenal indication of site fidelity, but it's also a phenomenal indication that he is finding what he needs to successfully live and thrive within the pine bush. And that almost certainly, I can't say certainly because we haven't caught a female or a young out there yet, but he almost certainly has a female or he wouldn't be sticking around and maintaining such a tight territory 3 years running. All right, now we have another question for monitoring success of restored sites where there isn't resources to set up a mapped birding station. Can you imagine a scale? Yes, and I have colleagues and friends at DEC that do some of this, that are doing some bird banding, and simply going out a couple of times during the breeding season and setting up mist nets and capturing what you have in these managed sites will tell you who's utilizing the habitat. And if you're able to do that even for a couple of days over the course of several years and look at how things are changing, you could collect some pretty good data. Again, the thing about having a bird in the hand is you can look at the ratio of males to females and the young birds to old birds. We can age birds up to 3 years in the hand based on molt limits. So having a bird in the hand and knowing how to age birds can tell you a lot. So if you're getting site fidelity, strong survivorship from year to year, and being able to band birds even for a couple of days and look at who's there and how many males and females you're catching, how many young birds to old birds, that's all a very valuable indication, very valuable information for ecosystem health. In my opinion, what would be the key basics of a program? One, having a bird banding permit from both the U.S. Geological Survey and the New York State DEC, and the basic training to be able to identify, age, and sex the birds. And if you want, I think my email was in the title slide. It's ngifford@albanypinebush.org. If you have additional logistical questions, I would be happy to try and address those separately. Matthew is asking, I think I heard you reference some light pollution impacts. Were there any sound pollution impacts? Almost certainly, but not that we have measured or I can speak to based on any amount of data. What the literature shows us is that in more urban sites, sound plays a role, but less of a role than light pollution per se, because birds in urban environments or loud environments actually amp up the volume. So research shows that birds singing in loud environments sing more loudly and sing more often to try and compensate. All right, Brenda is asking lastly here, let's see, Brenda, can unofficial point counts be done instead by audio recording equipment like the Swift recorder to determine bird species in the area? Yes, I know that remote recording equipment is being used. I have not used them and don't know enough about them, but I know that folks are using them. I can imagine they would be particularly good if you have a target species that is easy to identify, like a prairie warbler whose song is completely unique, or for example, the eastern whippoorwill whose song is really unique and enigmatic. I could see those remote automated recording devices being very highly valuable in documenting what species are living where. And it looks like that's all the questions we have, and we still have 10 minutes to the top of the hour, so I'm happy